Arrogant millionaire insults a street vendor. Not knowing who was watching everything, the morning air in Charleston bit like it had something to prove, the kind of cold that found its way through fur coats and designer gloves that made even the most expensive heels feel like frostbitten bricks. Veronica Blake stepped out of her black luxury car as if the weather dared to touch her. Her driver, a silent man in a pressed uniform, held the door without meeting her eyes. Veronica didn't notice. Or if she did, she didn't care. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement, echoing off the city's buildings. She wrapped her cream-colored fur tighter around her, curling her nose at the mingled scent of street food from a nearby vendor. Somewhere, someone was frying onions. Disgusting. The chaos of the city, horns, chatter, distant construction, clashed with her curated morning routine. This was supposed to be a simple day. A power meeting over espresso. A signed deal worth millions, and another notch in her professional empire. She was always in control. She was almost past the corner when a voice stopped her. "Good morning, ma'am. Would you like to see something beautiful, handmade?" Veronica turned. It was a woman seated on the sidewalk, half wrapped in layers of mismatched blankets and tattered coats. Her fingers, red from the cold, held up a scarf, deep blue and clearly made with care. Her hair was streaked with grey, her cheeks sunken, but her smile was real. Veronica blinked, confused for half a second that someone had dared speak to her. Then she laughed, loud enough to be heard by the man walking his dog, by the vendor tending his grill, by the young woman fumbling with her phone nearby. "Sweetheart," she said, each word dipped in venom. "The only beautiful thing on this sidewalk is me walking past you without looking." She turned on her heel and walked off, her chin high. Behind her, the woman, Rosa, did not speak again. She simply folded the scarf back over her knees, her smile fading. The same silence fell over the street that had heard Veronica's words. But not everyone had looked away. At a table not far from the cafe entrance, someone had watched the entire exchange. From behind dark glasses and a wool shawl pulled tight against her shoulders, a woman sipped from a small white cup, her eyes not on the menu, but on Veronica. She stirred her tea slowly, thoughtfully. Veronica swept into the cafe without a glance in that direction. Outside, Rosa leaned against the brick wall, her breath fogging in front of her face, and pulled the scarf up around her shoulders. It wasn't the first time someone had said something cruel to her, but somehow, this one stung more. Inside the cafe, Veronica was already ordering her usual, barking instructions about milk temperature and foam height. She didn't know that the woman she had dismissed so easily had once been a nurse, or that she had lost her job, her home, and then her family, one heartbreak at a time. She didn't know that the scarf Rosa had offered had taken 3 hours to make with stiff fingers and fading hope. And she certainly didn't know that her careless insult had not gone unnoticed. Because what Veronica couldn't see, what she didn't even imagine, was that the woman outside at the table was Margaret West. Margaret, who owned more than 20 companies. Margaret, who had built her empire not just on intelligence, but on instinct. Margaret, who had learned to watch when others looked away. She had been watching Veronica for some time, considering her for a new investment, a partnership that could redefine luxury retail. But now her eyes were focused not on Veronica's profile, not on her posture or the shine of her shoes, but on her words, words sharp enough to slice through more than just a scarf. Margaret set her cup down slowly. There are moments in life that last only a breath, but leave a mark as deep as a scar. Moments that split the path you were on and show you something you weren't ready to see. This was one of those moments. Veronica had walked past a woman she didn't see, spoken words she wouldn't remember, and believed none of it would matter. But it did, because someone powerful was watching, someone who could change everything, someone who, unlike Veronica, believed beauty was more than fabric and fur, that it could be found in the eyes of someone who had lost everything and still smiled at strangers. Someone who would remember this morning, not because of the deal that was about to fall apart, but because of the woman who had offered something handmade with trembling hands and a warm heart. And that morning, cold as it was, would soon become the fire that started something much, much bigger. A reckoning was coming, and with it, a chance for redemption or ruin. Margaret West had never been the type to rush into conclusions. In fact, patience was one of her oldest companions, At 72 years old, she had seen enough of life to understand that silence often said more than speeches, and a single moment could tell the truth that years of business meetings tried to conceal. Sitting in that chilly corner of Charleston, her shawl wrapped firmly around her shoulders, Margaret watched Veronica Blake disappear into the cafe with the kind of poise that came not from grace, but from practiced indifference. She didn't move, not right away. Her tea had gone lukewarm in its porcelain cup, the surface rippling slightly with the wind that swept in from the street, but her eyes stayed on the figure that remained on the sidewalk, Rosa. The woman hadn't gotten up. She didn't shout back, didn't curse the air or chase after the insult like some might. She simply adjusted the scarf in her lap, folding it with care, as if her dignity was stitched into every fiber. There was something hauntingly familiar in that. Margaret had seen it before, in women who'd weathered storms alone, in mothers who buried grief behind warm meals and fixed collars. In her own reflection, once upon a time, when she was a young widow with 2 toddlers and a mortgage no one thought she could pay off. She stood up slowly, taking her time. She didn't want to attract attention, not in the way Veronica had so effortlessly commanded it. Margaret's power was quieter, subtler. Her name opened doors behind closed rooms. Her fortune whispered through foundations and charities, not red carpets. And today, she had chosen to meet Veronica for a deal that could reshape luxury retail across 3 continents. It was meant to be simple, strategic, efficient. But how do you shake the hand of someone who, with just one sentence, strips dignity from another? Inside the cafe, the warm light glossed over gold-framed art and polished tables. Veronica was laughing at something the barista said, her voice loud, her body language open in the way people perform when they know they're being watched. She didn't even glance toward the window, didn't care if anyone followed. Why would she? Margaret paused just outside the door, adjusting her shawl again, then pulled out her phone. Not to make a call, not to scroll or distract herself. She opened the camera, lifted it slowly, and snapped a photo. Not of Rosa directly, but of the scarf, the colors, the hands. There was a story there, woven quietly, waiting for someone to notice. Veronica had never stood a chance. Minutes later, Margaret walked into the cafe, her cane clicking softly against the tiles. Veronica looked up immediately, smiling wide, and gestured grandly at the empty seat across from her. She was already talking before Margaret sat down, listing numbers, projections, terms that sounded clean and sharp, but meant little in the warmth of real life. Margaret listened, at least at first. She let Veronica speak until her coffee cooled and her confidence settled into rehearsed certainty. Then she leaned forward, voice soft but firm. "Veronica, do you know what I saw this morning?" Veronica paused, her eyes flicking for a second to the window. "Oh, do you mean that woman outside? That was nothing. Those people are everywhere in the city. Sad, really. But what can you do?" Margaret didn't flinch. "I saw how you treated her." Veronica's smile faltered just barely. "Look, Margaret, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just in a hurry. You know how these mornings go, everyone wanting something from you." "But she didn't want anything, Veronica," Margaret said. "She offered you something, a moment of kindness, and you crushed it like it was beneath you." There was a long pause. Veronica sat back, visibly annoyed now, arms folded. "Are we really doing this? I thought this was a business meeting." "It was," Margaret replied, her tone unchanged. "But now it's something else." And with that, she stood up. No drama, no voice raised, just the quiet weight of a woman who had made her decision. "I believe how someone treats those who can give them nothing tells you everything," she said gently but firmly. "And you've told me all I need to know." She left without looking back. Veronica remained at the table, stunned. The barista tried not to make eye contact. The room felt different now, smaller, colder. Out on the street, the city continued as always. But for Rosa, something had shifted too. She had seen the woman with the shawl earlier, seen her watching, and even though she didn't know her name or status, she had recognized something. Respect. The kind that doesn't come with money or fancy titles, but with eyes that really see. Later that afternoon, Rosa was still at her usual spot, pulling new yarn from her bag, her fingers working with practiced rhythm. The scarf she had shown earlier, the one Veronica had dismissed, now sat folded beside her. She hadn't given up on it, not yet. And in a nearby building, high above the street, Margaret was sitting with her assistant, laptop open, face thoughtful. "I want to know more about her," she said. "The woman on the sidewalk. Find out her name, where she's from, anything we can. There's something there." Her assistant nodded, hesitating for a moment. "What are you thinking?" Margaret looked out the window, her eyes following the sidewalk below. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that some people need a hand up. Not pity, not charity, just the chance to be seen." She tapped the photo on her screen, the scarf, resting in a pair of hands lined with history and strength. "She reminds me of someone I once knew, someone who didn't have anything but found a way to start again." The assistant didn't press further. She didn't need to. When Margaret West spoke with that tone, it meant something was already in motion. And somewhere on the edge of Charleston, a story was beginning. Not with money or press releases, but with a woman who still believed that what she made with her own two hands was worth offering to the world. No one else had noticed, but Margaret had. And that was enough to change everything. The interior of the cafe, despite its sleek design and curated modern decor, held a quiet tension in the air that morning. It wasn't the scent of the fresh espresso or the low hum of morning chatter. It was something more subtle, an invisible shift, like the way you feel when someone enters the room and everything stops breathing for just a moment. And in that silence, Veronica Blake sat at a corner table, confident and unaware that the world she had so carefully constructed was already beginning to tremble at the foundation. She had chosen her seat deliberately, facing the glass wall that overlooked the street, a view she liked because it reminded her of her rise. Years ago, she had walked these sidewalks with shoes barely intact, rushing between shifts at retail stores and night courses. She had worked for every cent in her early days, until those cents turned into investments, the investments into companies, and the companies into an empire. She carried herself like a monument to ambition. And today, she was moments away from signing a deal that could double the reach of her luxury brand. It was, by every metric she used to measure success, a perfect day. Her assistant had already confirmed that Margaret West had arrived at the cafe. Veronica smoothed her coat and adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist. She ordered the most expensive espresso on the menu, twice extracted, single origin, with a delicate foam pattern. Details mattered. Presentation mattered. So after all, Margaret was not just a businesswoman. She was the businesswoman. Elegant, sharp, and reputedly immune to charm. But Veronica was ready. She had studied her for months, learned her preferences, even practiced the rhythm of conversation she imagined would disarm someone like her. She was prepared for everything, or so she thought. Margaret entered the cafe with her usual quiet grace, her shawl drawn across her shoulders, a soft click of her cane announcing her steps. Her presence did not demand attention, it commanded it gently. Veronica rose with a practiced smile, the kind that glows just enough to seem genuine. Margaret nodded, but didn't return the smile. Instead, she lowered herself slowly into the seat, her gaze steady, her fingers wrapping gently around the warm ceramic of the tea she had ordered. Veronica launched in right away, speaking of projections, market trends, customer loyalty, the international expansion she envisioned. Her words were polished and quick, woven together like fabric. She expected affirmation, a nod, a signature. But Margaret said nothing. She let the words hover one by one until they lost weight in the silence between them. Then, gently, she set her cup down and looked directly at Veronica. Her voice was soft, but it carried across the table with the calm force of a tide coming in. "Veronica," she said, "do you believe the world sees you the way you see yourself?" The question was so unexpected that it took Veronica a full second to respond. She blinked, smiled again, and replied with a light chuckle, "Well, I suppose that depends on the lighting." Margaret didn't laugh. "I saw how you treated that woman outside." Veronica's smile faltered for the first time. She shifted in her seat, the confidence behind her eyes thinning ever so slightly. "That?" she said, waving a hand. "Oh, Margaret, that was nothing. Just one of those awkward encounters. You know how it is. People on the streets can be aggressive sometimes. I was just trying to get to our meeting." Margaret folded her hands on the table. She wasn't aggressive. She was offering you something. Something she made. Something meaningful to her. And you didn't just ignore her, Veronica. You humiliated her. The cafe fell quiet. Even the baristas seemed to pause mid-movement. Veronica glanced around, her posture suddenly stiff. "Margaret," she began, her tone tighter now, "I don't think it's fair to judge someone based on a 5-second moment. You don't know what kind of day I was having. You don't know what she's like. These people can be manipulative. They make you feel guilty just for walking past. It's not personal." "But it is," Margaret said calmly. "That's the whole point. It is personal. It always is." Veronica stared at her, trying to read the shift, trying to pivot the conversation back to safe territory. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Look, let's not let this moment ruin what we've built toward. This deal—" But Margaret was already reaching for her shawl. "No deal, Veronica." The words struck with such simplicity that they stunned. Veronica opened her mouth, then closed it, disbelief spreading across her features. "I've built my life making decisions about people," Margaret continued. "People think business is about numbers, but it's always about people. And I don't invest in someone who sees dignity as disposable. Not anymore." She stood slowly, gracefully, and turned to leave. Veronica rose to follow, a mix of desperation and pride fighting in her voice. "Margaret, wait. This isn't how these things end. You can't just walk away over one comment." Margaret paused just before the door. Without turning, she said, "Some doors close forever, Veronica, especially when the heart behind them is locked shut." And then she left. Veronica remained standing, stunned. Around her, the cafe returned to motion, but none of it reached her. Her espresso sat untouched, the foam now sinking, the heat gone. Outside, the city moved on. Rosa, still seated with her blankets and her handmade scarves, had not moved far. She had watched Margaret leave, had seen her pause just for a moment to look at her again with a faint nod of respect. She didn't know the details. She didn't need to. But something in the air felt different. Something had shifted. Veronica walked past her again moments later, this time without a word. Her eyes were fixed forward, her posture rigid. But Rosa didn't speak. She simply reached for another ball of yarn and began to weave. The world had seen something. And though she didn't know it yet, Rosa had become part of a story that was only just beginning to unfold, because one woman had been seen, and another had finally been seen through. The day after that fateful meeting, Charleston's dawn arrived with a hesitant tenderness, soft light filtering through the moss-draped oaks, a gentle hush that seemed to offer a second chance. The air carried the faint scent of salt from the nearby harbor and the promise of renewal. On the sidewalk where Rosa sat wrapped in blankets, her assortment of handmade scarves lay folded beside her in a worn basket, each stitch echoing hours of quiet perseverance. She lifted her gaze when the first rays of sunlight caught the edge of her table. A memory of yesterday's moment, a sharp word from Veronica, a compassionate glance from Margaret, tiptoed across her mind. Margaret had not forgotten. Early that morning, before the world had fully woken, she had mulled over the photograph she'd taken of the blue scarf still lingering on her phone screen. The yarn's deep, vivid hue had captured something alive, something neither cold nor invisible. That image stayed with her, more real than any chart or forecast. She called her assistant gently, asking with her voice calm yet certain, "Find her. Her name. Her story. There is dignity here, and I intend to hear it." By mid-morning, her assistant had found her, Rosa Martinez. She was 62, once a devoted nurse who raised 2 children with quiet strength after her husband's passing. Then came a divorce, a failed business, mounting debts, and eventually the street. But in every line on her hands lived tenderness, and in each scarf a memory of hope. Margaret's team prepared a small kindness, an insulated sandwich, warm tea, a fresh blanket, and delivered it to Rosa with gentle gratitude. Rosa accepted the offering with eyes softened by surprise. No pity, no performance, just recognition. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the teacup. She closed her eyes, inhaling the warmth. It had been so long since someone treated her like a person worth more than a glance. They spoke, not much at first, fragments of her story, of her granddaughter waiting for her return. Margaret listened, standing nearby but unassuming, giving Rosa the space to speak from her heart. Later that day, when Rosa returned to her usual spot, the weight of yesterday felt different. The scarf she had offered remained tucked beside her, But today she pulled out a new one, a pale rose hue that felt like forgiveness. She knitted slowly, each loop a word unsaid, but felt deeply. In Margaret's office, decisions were made, not in boardrooms, but in hearts. The marketing team drafted a new campaign concept, one that carried not a slogan, but a story. They drafted the lines, "She was invisible until someone saw her." Yet even those felt too scripted. It needed authenticity, not polish. It needed Rosa. That afternoon, Margaret called Rosa and asked if she would consider being part of something meaningful. The question trembled in both their worlds. Rosa thought of her granddaughter, of the nurse she once was, of the hours she spent creating something beautiful from thread and memory. She thought of dignity, buried under cold blankets and self-doubt. And then she said yes. When Rosa arrived at the modest downtown studio, she had on her pale rose scarf. The crew greeted her with respectful warmth. She was given a chair, wrapped in a soft robe, offered coffee or tea. They photographed her hands, lined like well-read pages, holding the scarves. They captured her face, strong and gentle, the eyes that had sheltered a world of loss, still shining with quiet resilience. The photographer asked her to say a few words later, but no one insisted. They let her look into the camera quietly, and the images that emerged were immediate and powerful. Not staged, but true. A woman with history in her hands, with stories in her eyes. Those images appeared on posters the next day across Charleston, on local buses, the newspaper, the cafe windows where so many had stared without seeing. And in each one, Rosa's pale rose scarf rested across her shoulders like a banner of endurance. Veronica saw them first on her way to a high-profile luncheon. She nearly turned the wheel aside when she recognized Rosa. The same woman, the same hands. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling sudden guilt and longing, as if seeing someone she had wronged reflect back in public view. But the image wasn't a humiliation, it was affirmation. Rosa looked back at the city with grace, no anger, just presence, invitation. In her office later, Veronica stared at the posters, her hands clasped tightly together. Her empire had been built on ambition and precision, but now she felt a gap that echoed a loneliness she'd ignored. What if she had someone there beside her watching with kindness? What if she had been kinder first? That evening, Margaret sat with Rosa at a low wooden table in her home. They shared a modest supper, soup, warm bread, fresh fruit, voices soft in the lamplight. Rosa spoke of nursing patients, of knitting scarves to comfort them when medicine failed. She spoke of the streets and the nights when loneliness became a cloak harder to shake than any blanket. Margaret listened, offering gratitude, offering faith. Rosa looked at Margaret and said quietly, "You saw me when no one else did." Margaret reached across the table, squeezed her hand and said, "And now everyone sees you." Somewhere in that gentle exchange, something changed, inside both women and perhaps in the city that was beginning to pay attention. Because a photograph can show what someone looks like, but a moment like that shows who they are. At the same time, Veronica, in her penthouse, stood by the window late into the night. She stared out at the city that had become small to her. The posters echoed in her memory. She thought about her own journey, the cost, the solitude, the moments she had ignored. She thought of a woman offering a scarf and of a woman listening with care. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, not ambition but regret. And maybe beneath that, hope. In the days that followed, the campaign expanded from posters to radio features and morning talks. Women of all ages, especially those who remembered the weight of invisibility, shared Rosa's story. Some knitted scarves in solidarity, others volunteered at shelters. Many simply spoke kind words to strangers. Because the story wasn't about recovery, it was about recognition. And through it all, Rosa remained not at the center, but at the heart. Margaret stayed quietly nearby, ensuring every detail honored Rosa's dignity. Veronica watched, learning not in lectures but in light. And so the city began to shift. One scarf, one story, one heart at a time. The morning breeze carried with it a kind of calm that felt earned, not offered. Charleston streets, still brushed with the faint dew of dawn, moved with quiet slowness, as if the city itself had paused to notice something it had long overlooked. At a small corner near a bus stop, Rosa sat again, but not as before. Something in her posture had shifted. Not proud in the traditional sense, but grounded, whole, as if the earth beneath her had finally remembered her weight and was holding her a little more gently. She had with her a new basket, lined with scarves in richer colors than before, some freshly knitted, others carefully cleaned and folded from previous weeks. Her hands worked methodically, but there was peace in her rhythm now. Each movement was steady, like a heartbeat finding its natural pace again after a long sprint. Passers-by slowed. Not all of them stopped, but more than before looked her in the eye. Some nodded, a few smiled. A woman in a grey sweater paused to compliment the rose-colored scarf on display. Rosa thanked her, and the woman kept walking, but it was a moment, a thread, a stitch in the larger fabric of her dignity being rewoven. Inside Margaret West's townhouse, just a few blocks away, a different kind of thread was being pulled. Margaret stood before a corkboard covered in notes, fabric swatches and photographs, not of models or product prototypes, but of faces. Faces of women who had lived quiet lives until loss pulled them into silence. Some were older, some young mothers. Some were still on the streets. Others had managed to step just outside of it. But all had been overlooked. Margaret's assistant, a young woman named Carla with a journal always tucked under her arm, entered the room holding 2 cups of tea. One was for Margaret. The other sat down quietly on the edge of the desk. "She's outside again," Carla said softly. "Rosa, she looks stronger today." Margaret nodded without turning. "She is, and she's not alone." She gestured to the board. "Each of these women has a story. Some still whisper it. Some barely remember the sound of their own voice. But Rosa reminded me how much power there is in being seen, and how dangerous the world becomes when we stop seeing." Carla nodded, her gaze drifting toward the photo of Rosa, her eyes gazing into the lens without performance. "Only truth." Margaret continued, her voice firmer now. "I want to launch something real, not just a campaign, a project, a movement, something that starts with stories, but ends with safety, with opportunity. I want the world to remember that women like Rosa are not lost causes. They are more often the very heart of resilience." She stepped back, looking at the sketches pinned to the wall. One in particular caught her eye, a simple graphic of a scarf unrolling into a ribbon, forming the outline of a woman standing tall. The working title, in neat handwriting below it, read, "Hands of Hope." Margaret picked up a pen and circled the name. "That's what we call it," she said, "Hands of Hope. And Rosa will be the face. Not because she needs saving, but because she's already saved something we forgot, our sense of humanity." The next few days passed like a soft whirlwind. Margaret's team moved quickly, not with corporate urgency, but with a kind of sacred intention. They spoke with local non-profits, shelters, and women's health groups. They gathered stories, not for spectacle, but for solidarity. They recorded voices of women willing to share their pain and their growth. They planned events that wouldn't just raise money, but build bridges, job fairs, therapy access, safe housing partnerships. At the center of it all was Rosa. She was hesitant at first when Margaret told her the idea. Her instinct was to retreat, to doubt her worthiness. She had lived so long being invisible that the thought of becoming a symbol felt almost foreign. But Margaret didn't ask her to be a symbol. She asked her to be herself. So Rosa agreed, not for glory, not for attention, but because deep down she knew there were others like her. Women who had once been teachers, nurses, caretakers, business owners. Women whose only crime was breaking under the weight of too much, too often, with too little help. And if her story could open even one door, she was willing to walk through it. The first official meeting for Hands of Hope was held in a modest community center. Folding chairs, coffee in mismatched mugs, walls that echoed the sound of every footstep. But it was full, every seat taken, and more standing near the back. Women of all ages filled the space, some holding worn purses, some with canes or strollers, some with faces etched in silence. But they listened. Rosa stood at the front with Margaret beside her. She didn't read a speech. She didn't use a microphone. She just told the truth. "I used to be someone," she began, her voice quiet but unwavering. "A nurse, a mother, a woman who knew her place in the world. And then, piece by piece, that place disappeared. I didn't see it happening. I just woke up one day and realized no one saw me anymore." A few heads nodded, eyes blinking with tears held back. But one day, she continued, someone didn't walk past me. She saw me. And now I know. I never stopped being someone. I had just stopped being seen. Silence followed, not empty but full. And then applause. Not loud, not frantic, just heartfelt. Margaret stepped forward after Rosa, her own eyes glistening. This project isn't about rescuing, she said. It's about remembering who we are, who we were, and who we can still become. In the weeks that followed, Hands of Hope became more than a name. It became a presence. A warm blanket handed out at midnight. A ride to a job interview. A phone call when the silence got too loud. A scarf knitted by Rosa and others handed from one woman to another as a sign, not of charity, but of shared strength. And slowly, the city began to change. Because when dignity is given a face, it becomes harder to ignore. And when a woman like Rosa stands tall, others begin to rise too, not behind her, but beside her. The morning was different now, as if the air itself had learned to breathe more gently. It no longer rushed past Rosa on the sidewalk like she wasn't there. It moved with her, wrapped around her, carrying the soft scent of coffee and warm bread from the corner cafe, where just weeks ago, her presence was invisible. The city was still the same in shape and stone, but for Rosa it felt as though Charleston had shifted just enough to let her in again. Margaret's car pulled up quietly. It wasn't the large black sedan she used for business. It was a modest vehicle, soft grey and unobtrusive, driven by a woman named Grace. Retired military, now part of Margaret's trusted circle. Rosa recognized the car now and greeted Grace with a nod, gathering her things carefully, protecting her newest scarf like it was a secret too precious to be folded without thought. "Ready?" Grace asked with a gentle smile, holding open the back door. Rosa didn't answer right away. She looked up at the morning sky, then back at the street corner, where she had once spent hours shivering through wind and shame. That corner had been her place of survival, but now it was part of her story, not the end of it. "Yes," she finally said. "I'm ready." The car rolled slowly through the quieter part of town, taking a route that avoided the harsh glare of the main avenues. Rosa watched the homes pass by, porches with rocking chairs, windows with half-drawn curtains. She used to live in a house not so different from these. She used to hang flower baskets in the spring, used to sit on the porch swing with her granddaughter curled against her side, both wrapped in blankets she'd sewn by hand. When they arrived at the studio, Rosa stepped out into a space unlike any she had known for years. Inside, the warmth wasn't just from the radiators or the bright lights. It was in the eyes of the people who greeted her. They didn't see a project or a token. They saw Rosa, a woman with something to say. A woman who had survived and was now ready to be heard. She was led to a small dressing room, walls lined with soft cotton and mirrors without harsh lights. The clothes hanging on the rack were simple but dignified. Long skirts, warm sweaters, scarves of every hue. Rosa touched the fabric slowly, letting her fingers remember what comfort felt like. One of the stylists, a woman in her late 50s with silver in her hair and a calming voice, offered her a seat and began to gently comb through her thick waves. No one rushed, no one pressed. It was care, not control. Rosa sat quietly, eyes closed, as hands worked through her hair and applied light makeup. She was not being transformed. She was being revealed. When she stepped in front of the camera, Rosa didn't know what to expect. She stood awkwardly at first, unsure of where to place her hands, unsure if she was even meant to be there. But then the photographer, a woman no younger than Rosa herself, stepped forward and said softly, "Just breathe. You're already beautiful." Rosa did, and as she exhaled, something shifted inside her. Her shoulders relaxed, her chin lifted. She let herself be seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. The first photo showed her standing against a soft grey backdrop, wearing a deep blue scarf, the same one she had once tried to offer to a woman who wouldn't look her in the eye. Now, the scarf was no longer a plea for attention. It was a banner of quiet triumph. Another photo showed her sitting, hands clasped in her lap, looking directly at the camera. No smile, no pose, just truth. The caption beneath it, handwritten by Margaret herself, read, "I was forgotten, but I never stopped being someone." The campaign launched that weekend. It began with a few posters placed strategically around Charleston in public libraries, community centers, coffee shops and bus stops. Then came the billboards, the digital banners, the whispered conversations in living rooms between mothers and daughters. It wasn't flashy, it was honest, and that made it powerful. Women began to talk, not just about Rosa, but about themselves, about the moments when they too had felt unseen, about how they had learned to shrink so the world wouldn't feel burdened by their presence, and how they now wanted to take up space again. Letters came in, handwritten notes from across the state, some from grandmothers who saw Rosa and remembered their own lost years, others from younger women who said, "Thank you for showing me what strength looks like." Margaret read everyone, and she showed Rosa the ones she thought would mean the most. One letter from a woman named Clara in her 70s simply said, "You reminded me that I still matter, that I am not invisible to everyone. Thank you." Rosa cried quietly when she read that one. She had never thought of herself as a reminder, but perhaps that was exactly what she had become, a mirror for women who needed to remember their own worth. Veronica too saw the photos. She had stayed away at first, certain the wave would pass, that people would forget. But the image was everywhere, not just of Rosa, but of a new kind of power, one built not on titles or status, but on survival and softness. And it shook her, because in the silence of her own penthouse, Veronica had begun to feel the emptiness of success earned without grace. She stared at Rosa's photo late one night, her fingers brushing the edge of the magazine page. The scarf Rosa wore, Veronica recognized it, and yet, in that image, it looked transformed. It didn't carry the shame she had cast upon it. It carried pride, purpose, and Veronica felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not envy, not guilt, but longing. The studio closed late that night, and Rosa remained behind with Margaret, sitting on a worn couch near the back wall. They sipped tea together, speaking little, just resting in the soft quiet of shared understanding. "You looked radiant today," Margaret said, not with flattery, but with truth. Rosa smiled. "I didn't feel radiant, just full, like I remembered myself." Margaret reached over and placed a hand on hers. "That's what light does. It helps us find the parts we thought we lost." And in that room, under the low hum of studio lights and the warmth of friendship, Rosa felt something deeper than pride. She felt peace, because the light didn't just shine on her, it came from within her. It started slowly, like all honest things do. A whisper, a glance, a photograph passed between hands at a kitchen table. Then it became a conversation between neighbors in grocery store aisles, a pause during a book club gathering, a tear shed quietly by someone who hadn't realized how long it had been since she felt seen. Rosa's face, calm, real, unposed, was appearing everywhere. On the back cover of community magazines, at the edge of bus shelters, even in small print ads tucked between recipes and gardening tips in publications, read faithfully by women who had lived long enough to remember a world that often forgot them. What began as a portrait campaign in Charleston had spread beyond state lines in a matter of days. Something in the photo, in Rosa's eyes, stirred a sense of recognition that crossed generations. It wasn't about charity or sensationalism. It was about remembering something deeply personal, the longing to matter, especially after years of being told in 1,000 small ways that your story had already been written and that it was over. Margaret knew what she had sparked, but even she was surprised by how quickly it caught fire. Her marketing team was flooded with messages from media outlets, organizations, and individuals across the country. Some wanted to feature Rosa's story, others simply wanted to say thank you. Thank you for showing us a face that doesn't sell illusions, but truth. Thank you for reminding us that age does not erase worth. Thank you for giving us someone who looks like our mothers, our sisters, our past, and maybe even our future. Rosa herself had no social media, no desire for fame, but that didn't stop her name from spreading. Her image was reprinted on posters and postcards. Her words were quoted in newsletters and interviews. And her scarves, once sold for spare change on a cold sidewalk, became symbols of something far greater: resilience wrapped in fabric. The day a national morning show aired a short feature about the campaign, Rosa watched the screen from Margaret's living room, her hands clutching the hem of her skirt. The segment was simple, heartfelt. It showed clips of Rosa's photo shoot, her words about being forgotten, and a few testimonials from women across the country who had seen the image and written in. One woman, in tears, said, "I saw Rosa's face and thought, that could have been me. And I realized, I'm not finished yet." Rosa didn't speak for a long time after the program ended. She just sat there, shoulders soft, eyes wet. Margaret placed a cup of tea in front of her and sat beside her on the couch, silent as well. There was no need to fill the space. Sometimes recognition itself is overwhelming, especially when it comes after a lifetime of feeling unseen. Elsewhere in the city, Veronica watched the same segment from her office, but the experience struck her differently. The image of Rosa on national television, described as the face of dignity, was not just touching, it was humbling. Veronica, once so sure of her control over every narrative, every room she entered, felt a tightening in her chest. Not out of jealousy, but from the sharp realization that while she had built an empire of visibility, she had contributed nothing to the lives of those who remained hidden. Her staff, seated just outside her office, noticed the silence that followed. Veronica remained still for several minutes after the broadcast ended, her phone buzzing silently beside her with emails and meeting alerts she didn't answer. She stared out the window, her reflection mingling with the city skyline. Somewhere down there, Rosa's face was on a billboard, and hers was not. And yet, strangely, she didn't resent it. She envied the depth of it. That Rosa, a woman with no company name, no luxury portfolio, could move hearts in a way that Veronica had never managed, even at her highest moment. Because Rosa's strength came from having nothing to prove, and Veronica's empire, it seemed, had been built on proving everything. As the campaign grew, Margaret arranged for Rosa to meet with other women whose lives had been touched by the movement. Some were formerly homeless, others had escaped abusive marriages, a few were older professionals forced into retirement before they were ready. They gathered not for cameras but for connection. At a local community center, they shared meals, laughter, silence. They exchanged scarves, some of Rosa's, some of their own making, as if each piece of yarn were a thread from their own story, now being handed to someone else who would understand. The space became something sacred, a living room for the broken and the healing. Rosa often sat quietly in these meetings, listening more than speaking. She didn't want to lead. She simply wanted to be present. And that, perhaps, was why the others leaned in closer, trusted her without hesitation. One woman, Marion, 74, had spent the last decade caring for a husband who no longer remembered her name. She spoke only once during the meeting, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder," she said, "if I disappeared, would anyone notice?" Rosa reached for her hand without speaking, and they sat like that for the rest of the evening. That moment, like so many now surrounding Rosa's days, would not make the news, but it would change the shape of a life. The campaign's next wave included a line of limited edition scarves, handmade by Rosa, and several women from the local shelter program Margaret now funded under the Hands of Hope initiative. Each scarf carried a small tag sewn inside, with the phrase Rosa had spoken that first day in the studio, "I was forgotten, but I never stopped being someone." They sold out in 48 hours. What surprised Rosa most wasn't how many people bought them, but who. It wasn't just affluent women from the cities. It was grandmothers from rural towns, nurses from small hospitals, retired teachers, widows living alone. The scarves were being purchased by women who didn't need fashion, but needed meaning. They wrapped them around their necks not to impress, but to remember, to say in their own quiet way, "I matter too." One afternoon, while walking through a local market with Grace, Rosa saw a woman wearing one of her scarves. She didn't say anything. She didn't approach. She simply smiled and kept walking, her fingers brushing the scarf she wore herself, the very first one she had ever made after moving to Charleston. It was old now, the blue faded in parts, the edges slightly frayed. But to Rosa, it was her beginning. That night she wrote a letter, not for the public, not for a campaign, just for herself. She wrote, "I used to think my story had ended when I lost everything. But now I see I was just in the quiet chapter between who I was and who I was meant to become. The world didn't change overnight, but someone saw me, and that gave me the strength to see myself. She folded the letter and tucked it into the bottom of her knitting basket, because Rosa knew now that recognition is not the same as fame. It's deeper than applause. It's being remembered by yourself, most of all. The mail had been sitting unopened for 2 days on Veronica's glossy mahogany desk. Envelopes stamped with gold-lettered logos, proposals, invitations, one from a European fashion house requesting a partnership, another from a design institute offering an honorary board position. Normally, she would have read each one before her second cup of espresso. But something was different now. Something inside her had gone quiet. Not the cold, proud silence she used to weaponize in boardrooms. No, this silence felt hollow, heavy. Her office was still immaculate. Everything in its place. The view of the city skyline framed perfectly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, her awards arranged like trophies on a shelf behind her, but the atmosphere no longer held the same power. Veronica sat in her leather chair, her phone dark beside her, staring at the latest image of Rosa Blake, now featured in a national women's magazine that had landed in her mailbox that morning. There she was, sitting on a wooden stool, a soft coral scarf resting on her shoulders. A slight smile playing at her lips, not staged, not styled, just Rosa, human, warm, undeniably present. The headline read, "The face that reminded us what strength looks like." Veronica read the article 3 times, not because it was complicated, but because it undid something in her. Each paragraph carried a weight that settled deeper into her chest. They had interviewed Margaret too. She had spoken not only of the campaign, but of the decision that started it all, the moment she turned away from a deal because she had witnessed cruelty disguised as indifference. And even though no names were mentioned, everyone in the industry knew who she meant. Veronica didn't need the public to point it out. Her staff had already become quieter around her. Clients were cancelling lunches without explanation. Her PR manager had sent a carefully worded email suggesting they monitor sentiment closely. The irony was cruel. After building her entire career on visibility, she was now becoming known for the very moment she wished no one had seen. And yet, what pierced her most wasn't the loss of prestige. It was the way Rosa carried herself through it all, with grace, with a softness that didn't need sharpness to be strong. The scarf Rosa had tried to offer her that morning, the one she had dismissed with a venomous comment, was now hanging in the window of a boutique she used to frequent. A symbol, a story, a quiet revolution. In a moment of desperation, mixed with a spark of remorse, Veronica picked up her phone and dialed the number she hadn't used since the cafe incident, Margaret's direct line. It rang twice. "Margaret West," came the familiar voice, calm and composed. There was a pause. Veronica's voice almost failed her. "It's Veronica," she said, forcing steadiness. I saw the magazine and the campaign. It's moving." Margaret didn't reply immediately. She let the silence do the work. "I made a mistake," Veronica said finally. "That day, I know that now. I didn't realize, or maybe I did, but I didn't care to think about it. Either way, I see it clearly now." More silence. "I'd like to meet," Veronica added, the words nearly choking her pride. "If you'd be open to that. I'd like to support the project, or speak to Rosa, or even just apologize." Margaret's voice, when it came, was not harsh. It was firm, tempered with the wisdom of someone who had long since learned to separate emotion from discernment. "Some doors, Veronica," she said gently, "once closed, don't open the same way again." Veronica exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers to her forehead. "I understand. But," Margaret continued, "that doesn't mean you can't walk through another one. It just won't be mine." And then she hung up. Veronica set the phone down, feeling the silence return. Not hollow this time, but full of something else, something closer to humility, something she hadn't worn in decades. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. The same buildings, the same streets, but now she saw things differently. She imagined Rosa on one of those corners, scarf in hand, kindness offered freely to a stranger who had failed to see her. That moment had passed, but its impact had not. The following week, Veronica made a decision. Quietly, and without press releases or photographers, she reached out to a local women's shelter with no mention of who she was or what had happened. She asked how she could help, where she could volunteer. The director, unaware of the headlines, welcomed her politely. Veronica spent 3 afternoons there that month, folding clothes, serving food, listening. She didn't talk about her company. She didn't wear her signature coats. She showed up and that was all. No one recognized her, except for one woman, an older volunteer named Ruth, who offered her a small smile after their shift. "You're her, aren't you?" Ruth said softly. "From that cafe story." Veronica stiffened. "Don't worry," Ruth added. "People make mistakes. What matters is what they do after." Veronica nodded, her eyes wet. Later, in the quiet of her car, she allowed herself to cry. Not for what she had lost, but for what she had never really had in the first place. A sense of groundedness, connection, truth. Meanwhile, Rosa continued her journey, unaware of the weight her presence had carried. She spent her mornings knitting with other women in a local co-op Margaret had helped launch. She shared stories, taught others her patterns, laughed more than she had in years. She had even spoken at a small school event, standing beside her granddaughter as they told their story of strength, of not giving up, even when the world seemed to have stopped listening. That night, after the event, her granddaughter hugged her tightly. "Grandma," she whispered, "you're famous." Rosa chuckled. "I don't need to be famous. I just want to be remembered." And she would be. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with fire but with quiet, knitted in soft wool, spoken in gentle tones, carried by women who know that grace does not mean silence, and dignity is not something anyone else can give you. It's something you carry, and once you rediscover it, no one can take it away. The studio lights were warmer than Rosa expected, not harsh or blinding as she had feared, but soft and golden, casting a gentle glow across her face. She sat in the middle of the stage on a cushioned chair, the kind that reminded her of Sunday afternoons from long ago, when she would sit on her porch knitting while the world passed by. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, her favorite scarf, a soft grey with a hint of lilac, draped over her shoulders. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't new, but it was hers, and it carried the weight of every quiet triumph she had earned since the day Margaret West first stopped to see her. Across from her, the host sat poised but kind, a woman in her 50s with a presence that made Rosa feel less like she was on national television and more like she was in a friend's living room. The cameras were rolling. The audience was silent. The producer had whispered the countdown seconds ago, but Rosa had already forgotten the numbers. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to speak, and she knew exactly what she wanted to say. The segment had been introduced with a brief montage of the Hands of Hope campaign. Photographs of Rosa in the early days, still weathered by hardship but wrapped in grace, flashed across the screen. Scenes of her teaching other women to knit, of her laughing beside Margaret, of her walking hand in hand with her granddaughter at a local school event. The narrator had called her the woman who became a symbol of strength simply by being herself. When the host turned to Rosa, the room settled deeper into silence, the kind that leans forward in anticipation. "Rosa," the host began, her voice smooth and respectful, "you've captured the hearts of women across the country. But take us back. What was life like before all of this?" Rosa breathed in slowly, grounding herself. "There was a time," she said, "when I woke up every day wondering if I was still part of the world. When you live on the street, you start to believe what people's eyes tell you, that you're no longer real, that you're just something to step around." The audience held its breath. "I used to be a nurse," Rosa continued. "I took care of people. I held hands in hospital rooms. I whispered to patients when they were scared. And then one day, everything slipped. Divorce, lost work, bills I couldn't pay. I tried to keep going, but life has a way of closing doors faster than you can find the keys." She paused, glancing briefly at the host before returning her gaze to the audience. "I didn't turn bitter, I just turned invisible." A few women in the audience dabbed their eyes. Some leaned in, their own stories flickering behind their expressions. "But then," Rosa said, her voice strengthening, "someone saw me, really saw me, and not because they needed anything from me. Margaret didn't offer pity, she offered presence. She sat beside me and listened, and somehow that started stitching me back together." The host nodded gently. "And now you're the face of something so much bigger. What has that meant to you?" Rosa smiled, not the shy smile of someone overwhelmed, but the kind of smile that only comes from knowing your story finally has space to breathe. "I don't see myself as a face," she replied. "I see myself as a reminder that women like me, women who have lived, who have endured, who have loved and lost and kept going, we don't disappear, we don't expire, we evolve, and we still have so much to give." Applause broke out, not thunderous, not forced, just steady, heartfelt appreciation. The host waited, then leaned in again. "If there's one thing you'd like every woman watching to know, what would it be?" Rosa took a long moment before answering. Her eyes scanned the crowd, her fingers brushing the scarf on her shoulder. "I'd tell them," she began, her voice now trembling with emotion, "that you don't have to be loud to be powerful, you don't have to be young to be worthy, and you don't have to be perfect to be loved. You just have to keep showing up even when no one sees you yet." The room erupted, not in noise but in something deeper. Women began to stand, some slowly, some with hands held to their hearts. It was a moment of collective recognition, as if Rosa had said aloud what so many had been waiting their whole lives to hear. After the interview, Rosa was led backstage. She wasn't trembling, she wasn't overwhelmed, she was quiet, steady. She sat in the dressing room chair and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman who stared back wasn't unfamiliar. She was just finally returned. Margaret arrived minutes later, smiling without words. She placed a hand on Rosa's shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long time. Two women who had found each other not in business or fame, but in the quiet strength of empathy. Meanwhile, phones across the country lit up. Clips of the interview circulated online. The quote, "You don't have to be loud to be powerful," was shared thousands of times. Granddaughters called their grandmothers. Women in retirement homes wrote each other letters. Book clubs chose to discuss Rosa's story instead of their usual selections. In small towns and big cities, people began to ask the same question: who have I walked past without seeing? The interview did more than move hearts. It changed rhythms. It slowed people down. It made strangers look up and make eye contact. And for many, it stirred a memory of who they once were, before life made them small, before grief made them quiet, before age made them feel erased. Rosa returned to Charleston 2 days later. At the airport, a woman in her 70s approached her in the terminal with soft eyes and a trembling voice. "I watched you," she said, "and I remembered myself." Rosa hugged her. No words were needed. Back in her modest apartment, Rosa unpacked slowly. The scarf she wore on the show was folded carefully and placed in a drawer lined with lavender sachets. It was not for sale. It was hers. Her granddaughter came to visit that evening, excited, arms full of newspapers and clippings. "You were amazing," she said, "like a star." Rosa shook her head and kissed the top of the girl's curls. "No, sweet girl," she whispered. "I'm not a star. I'm just a woman who stopped hiding." And somewhere on television screens, in newspapers, on coffee tables across the nation, her words kept echoing. Because when a woman who thought she had been forgotten finds her voice again, the world listens. And sometimes it even remembers how to be kind. In the quiet hum of early morning, the streets of Charleston felt different. Not because they had changed physically, but because something invisible now pulsed through them. A sense of awareness, a warmth that hadn't been there months ago. Cafes that once bustled with hurried conversations and phones buzzing on countertops now displayed posters of Rosa in their windows. Small shops had bowls of yarn placed beside registers with signs that read, "For the Hands of Hope Project, knit with love, knit with purpose." It hadn't started out that way. The idea was simple: amplify Rosa's story, elevate her voice, and use that momentum to shine a light on the countless other women whose lives had fallen into the quiet shadows of hardship. But as the days passed and the campaign grew, it no longer belonged to just Rosa or Margaret, or even Charleston. It had become something much larger. It had become a movement. Margaret, seated at her long oak desk, looked over the updated report. Her foundation, once focused primarily on educational initiatives, had seen a wave of support like never before. Donations had poured in, not just from wealthy donors, but from women who mailed envelopes with $10 and notes that read, "This is all I can spare, but it comes with my heart." One letter, written in delicate cursive on floral stationery, simply said, "Thank you for reminding me I am still someone." But Margaret wasn't interested in numbers. She circled programs and sketched expansions. She organized meetings with shelters and job training centers. She wanted real change, not symbolic gestures. What began with Rosa had opened a door, and Margaret was determined to keep it open long enough for thousands more to walk through. In a renovated brick building downtown, Rosa now worked with a small team, women who, like her, had faced homelessness, isolation, or abuse. Together, they ran the Hands of Hope workshop, a warm, light-filled space where scarves were knitted not just as garments but as messages. Each scarf carried a tag stitched on the inside, made by a woman rebuilding her life, worn by someone who believes in second chances. The workshop wasn't just for production, it became a refuge. There were couches, donated books, a tea kettle always on. Women came not only to work but to breathe, to feel that they had a place in the world again. Rosa, though still modest and reserved, had found her rhythm. She arrived each morning before the others, setting out materials, humming to herself. She spoke with women quietly, offering guidance or simply sitting beside them. She had a softness that invited honesty. One younger woman, just 22 and recently out of a toxic marriage, once said, "Miss Rosa, I don't know what I'm supposed to be." Rosa had smiled gently and replied, "You're supposed to be exactly who you're becoming. That's enough." Word spread. Other cities began reaching out. Churches offered to open knitting circles. Libraries hosted storytelling nights for women to share their paths back to dignity. Retired women, many living alone, wrote to Margaret asking how they could help. And slowly, the movement bloomed across the country, stitching women of all backgrounds into a single unbreakable fabric of compassion. But even as it grew, Rosa remained grounded. She still lived in her modest apartment, still rode the bus when she could, still made tea with honey in the evenings, and watched the sky dim through her window. She didn't want fame. What she wanted was to make space for herself and for others. One afternoon, Rosa received a letter forwarded from Margaret's office. The envelope was thick, hand-addressed. Inside, a note from a woman named Cecilia, 76 years old, living in a small town in Iowa. Cecilia wrote, "For years, I've been invisible in my own home. My children are busy. My husband passed 10 years ago. No one asks how I am. But I saw your interview. I saw your eyes. And I remembered how I used to be strong, too. I took out my knitting needles for the first time in 15 years. My hands are slower now, but they still remember. Thank you, Rosa. You reminded me of my name." Rosa sat with that letter in her lap for a long time, tears gently slipping down her cheeks. Not from sorrow, but from the quiet joy of knowing that something she had once done simply to survive had become something that helped others remember how to live. Margaret, too, found herself transformed. She had always cared. Her work, her philanthropy, had always come from a genuine place. But this project had given her something she hadn't expected: clarity. For so long, she had believed that her value came from strategy, from planning, from building institutions. But now, she saw that her greatest impact came from listening, from noticing, from sitting down beside someone instead of standing in front of them. At the annual gala for her foundation, a grand event usually marked by elegant gowns and sharp speeches, Margaret did something different. She scrapped her pre-written speech and invited Rosa on stage with her. Rosa was hesitant. She had never stood before hundreds of people in formal attire, but Margaret took her hand and walked with her to the microphone. They stood together, two women of different backgrounds, different worlds, but connected by something deeper. Margaret spoke first. "This is Rosa. You know her face, you've heard her story. But tonight I want you to know her heart, because it's from her heart that all of this has grown. And what began as a photo campaign has become a nationwide call to remember each other." She stepped back. Rosa looked out into the sea of faces. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't need to. "I'm not here because I'm special," she said. "I'm here because someone made space for me. And now, we are making space for others." That night, donations reached new heights. But more importantly, so did understanding. Back at the workshop the next morning, Rosa arrived early, as always. She made tea, opened the windows, and prepared the room. She wasn't expecting applause. That night was behind her. What mattered was today, another chance to welcome a woman in from the cold, another scarf to knit, another soul to remind that she was still someone. Because that was the real movement, not the headlines, not the fame, but the daily work of dignity. Autumn arrived gently in Charleston. The breeze softened, the leaves blushed into golden hues, and the air held that familiar mix of nostalgia and promise. It was the season when women began pulling out their scarves, not just for warmth, but for comfort. And this year, many of those scarves bore Rosa's careful stitching, each one a testimony not only to her hands, but to the hands and hearts of hundreds of women whose lives had quietly changed. The Hands of Hope initiative had grown beyond what anyone imagined. There were now local chapters in 14 cities, dozens of women employed and supported, thousands of scarves distributed, and countless conversations started. But for Rosa, life remained humble. She still rode the bus when she could. She still carried her knitting bag with care. And she still woke each day grateful, not for fame, but for the steady rhythm of being needed again. Then, one quiet Tuesday, something arrived in her mailbox that she hadn't expected. A cream-colored envelope, sealed with a soft wax insignia she didn't recognize. Her name was handwritten across the front with careful strokes. Inside was an invitation, printed in elegant script. The West Foundation and Hands of Hope cordially invite you to an evening of celebration and community. In gratitude, in remembrance, in promise. There was a second card tucked behind it, also handwritten. Rosa, you once offered kindness and were met with cruelty. That cruelty became your seed, and what grew from it changed lives. I hope you will allow this moment to be one of healing, for all of us. Warmly, Veronica Blake. Rosa read the note twice, then again, letting the meaning settle like snow on a quiet roof. She had not thought of Veronica in weeks, maybe months. Not out of bitterness. She had simply chosen to focus forward. But now this invitation, this small act of humility, brought with it a complicated warmth. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a beginning. Margaret, when Rosa called her, had already known. Of course she had. She was hosting the event, and though she hadn't insisted Veronica be there, she had not opposed it either. She asked to come, Rosa, Margaret said calmly. She didn't ask for the spotlight. She just asked to be present. I told her that would be up to you. Rosa was silent for a moment, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. I'll come, she said simply. The event was held in a large converted conservatory in the heart of the city, filled with low tables, warm lighting, and displays of scarves from every chapter of the project. Each table bore the name of a city, and on each scarf's tag was not just the maker's name, but one word they had chosen to describe their journey. Still, seen, strong, whole. Guests arrived slowly. Supporters, donors, women who had been touched by the project, volunteers, family members. There was no formal stage, no dramatic spotlight. The night had been designed to feel like a home, not a show. Just before the program began, Rosa arrived. She wore a deep navy dress, modest and elegant, with a pale rose scarf wrapped lightly around her shoulders. Her granddaughter held her hand as they entered, eyes wide at the glowing space. The room quieted not from protocol but from reverence. People turned and smiled, some placing hands over their hearts. Rosa, ever gracious, nodded softly as she passed them, feeling not celebrity but kinship. Margaret greeted her at the door and embraced her with warmth that had deepened over months of shared purpose. They spoke little, letting their eyes say the rest. And then, across the room, Rosa saw her. Veronica stood near a quiet corner, away from the center, dressed in charcoal gray, no glitter, no ornaments. Her hair was pulled back simply, her hands clasped. When their eyes met, Veronica gave a slight nod. It was not confident. It was not rehearsed. It was almost vulnerable. Rosa hesitated for just a breath, then walked over. They stood a few feet apart at first, two women on either side of a wound. "Thank you for inviting me," Rosa said softly. "Thank you for not refusing," Veronica replied, her voice low but steady. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Veronica reached into her bag and pulled out a carefully folded scarf, a soft cream color, the kind Rosa used to sell on the street. She unfolded it slowly and held it out. "I bought this from one of the booths at the co-op last week," she said. "It was labeled forgiveness. I don't know if I deserve it, but I've kept it near me every night since." Rosa looked at the scarf, then at the woman who months ago had dismissed her humanity with a single cruel phrase. "There was a time," Rosa began gently, "when I would have wanted you to feel what I felt that day. Alone, invisible, but not anymore. I've learned that pain passed forward only grows, but pain faced, pain named, can become something else." She placed her hand briefly on Veronica's. "I don't know what you're carrying, but I hope you lay some of it down." Veronica's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She nodded, holding the scarf to her chest. "Thank you," she said, "for this, and for everything since." The rest of the evening unfolded like a gentle tide. Stories were shared. Music played softly. Women stood to give brief thanks, not in speeches, but in simple words. Rosa sat with her granddaughter, fingers entwined, heart full. At the end of the night, Margaret stepped forward to address the group. She did not call attention to herself. She simply raised her glass and said, "To the women who remind us that kindness is not weakness, that silence is not the absence of story, and that hope, when shared, becomes a home." And then, the final gesture. Rosa stood, walked to the center of the room, and held out a scarf, a pale blue one, worn and soft, the first one she had made when she arrived in Charleston, the one she had never sold, the one she had kept as a reminder. She handed it to Margaret. "This was my beginning," she said, "and now it belongs to the one who helped me find my middle." Margaret's eyes filled with quiet tears as she took it, folding it gently over her arm. The room held its breath, then exhaled together, not in applause but in shared presence. And as the evening came to a close, people didn't rush to leave. They lingered, spoke softly, hugged one another. Because this was not a celebration of an individual, it was the honoring of something collective, a movement stitched not in protest but in love. Outside, the wind had picked up. The leaves rustled softly, but inside, warmth remained. In the faces of women who had found each other, in the hands that had stitched pain into purpose, and in the hearts of those who, for the first time in a long time, knew they belonged. The autumn wind had turned crisp overnight. Charleston streets were scattered with amber leaves that whispered under the shoes of early morning walkers. In Rosa's modest apartment, the window was slightly open, letting in the chilled air that carried the scent of cinnamon from the bakery down the street. She was up early, as usual, but today she didn't reach for her knitting needles first. Today was different. Today she reached into the bottom drawer of her cedar chest, the one where she kept a few sacred things wrapped in tissue and memories. She unfolded the cloth carefully. Inside was a blue scarf, slightly faded, the yarn soft with age, the ends a bit worn from time. This was the very first scarf she had made after losing everything. It had been with her on the street corner that cold morning when Veronica Blake had dismissed her with that cruel remark. Rosa had never sold it. She had kept it as a quiet witness to her journey, not for nostalgia, but for remembrance. Every knot in the pattern held a moment of uncertainty, every row a prayer for another day of survival. And now, it had become something else entirely, a symbol of what had changed and what had endured. Later that afternoon, Rosa was expected at a gathering, one last event before the winter season, hosted not by Margaret or any foundation, but by the women of the first knitting circle, the very group that had once sat with her in silence as she guided their hands through yarn and hope. They had invited Rosa for a simple celebration of their year together. No speeches, no press, just warmth and shared bread. Rosa felt honored in a way that required no headlines. These were the women who had learned with her, healed with her. They were her quiet circle of strength. Before leaving her apartment, Rosa wrapped the blue scarf gently into a linen pouch and placed it in her bag. She didn't yet know why. She only knew that something about this day called for it. At the community center, the room was already filled with soft laughter and the clinking of dishes. Scarves hung on a makeshift clothesline across the windows, each one unique, made with hands that had trembled and grown stronger over time. Tea brewed on a side table, its steam curling up into the light like a hymn. Rosa entered quietly, her presence enough to draw warm glances from across the room. No one stood or clapped. That wasn't how this space worked. Here, admiration was expressed through soft touches and offered chairs, not performance. She made her way to a small table where Margaret was already seated, surrounded by several women from the group. Margaret had aged gracefully in these past months. Her hair, now fully silver, seemed to glow under the warm light. She wore no jewelry except a simple silver brooch shaped like a leaf. When Rosa approached, Margaret rose slowly and opened her arms. They embraced wordlessly, the kind of embrace that held months of shared purpose and quiet strength. When they sat, Rosa placed the linen pouch gently on the table between them. "This," she said softly, "was the first scarf I ever made in Charleston. I never sold it. I never gave it away. I held on to it because I needed to remember who I was before anyone else did." Margaret looked at the pouch with reverence. Her fingers, steady and elegant, opened the linen wrap and lifted the scarf slowly, unfolding it like a sacred page. She didn't speak. She simply ran her hand across the pattern, reading it like a letter. "I want you to have it," Rosa continued, "not as a token, but as a reminder. You saw me when I didn't think I was worth seeing. This scarf carries that moment, and I think it belongs with you now." Margaret's eyes softened with emotion. She didn't argue or deflect. She knew better than to reject a gift like this. Instead, she folded it once more carefully and placed it across her lap. "I will treasure it," she said, "and I will remember what it means." Around them, the conversations flowed gently. The women shared stories, knitting new beginnings into their words. One spoke of reuniting with her son after years apart. Another had returned to school at the age of 69. A third had finally left the shelter and now ran a small shop where she sold the scarves made by the women in the program. Each story was told without fanfare, as if it was simply what came next. Near the end of the gathering, Margaret stood with the blue scarf still in hand and called for a moment of quiet. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "There are some objects," she began, "that carry more than weight. They carry memory. Not the kind we place in photo albums or shelves, but the kind that lives in our bones." She turned to Rosa. "This scarf," she continued, "is more than yarn. It's the moment a woman chose to keep creating, even when the world offered no applause. And now it will hang in our new center, not in a glass case, but on the wall by the front door, so that every woman who walks in will know they are entering a space built on survival and on beauty born from it." The room was silent. Then, one by one, women stood, each holding their own scarves, and began pinning them gently onto the long stretch of twine along the wall. It became a tapestry of color, shape, and spirit. Rosa stood beside Margaret, watching it come to life, her heart full but steady. After the event, as the sun began to set, Rosa walked alone through the quiet streets. Her granddaughter had gone home earlier, and Margaret had stayed behind to help clean. Rosa didn't mind being alone. Not anymore. Her footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, and the wind played gently with the ends of her rose-colored scarf. She stopped at the very corner where it had all begun. The sidewalk was clean now. No crates, no baskets, no scarves laid out for passers-by. But in her mind, Rosa could still see her old self, sitting on a blanket, hands red from the cold, eyes searching for something beyond coins. She didn't stay long, just enough to whisper a thank you to the space that had once held her most vulnerable moments. Then she turned and walked on. At home, she brewed tea, sat by the window, and picked up a fresh skein of yarn. Her hands moved gently, rhythmically. She wasn't making this scarf for anyone in particular. She just knew that someone someday would need it, and she would be ready, because that's what the blue scarf had taught her, that beginnings can come wrapped in pain. But what we do with them, that becomes the story we leave behind. The morning sun rose slowly over Charleston, casting long golden streaks across the cobbled streets. It was one of those quiet, breathless mornings where even the birds seemed to pause their songs, as if the city itself was taking a moment to reflect. The leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and the world, for a moment, felt still. Inside a new building tucked behind a quiet courtyard, simple in its architecture but warm in every detail, women arrived one by one. There were no television cameras, no media banners, no official ribbon to cut. But in the heart of that modest center, a story had finally come full circle. It was called the Rosa Center for Women. The name had been chosen not by Margaret, nor by Rosa herself, but by the Women in the Hands of Hope project, those who had been lifted and seen, who had found strength in stories that echoed their own. And now, as Rosa stood at the entrance, holding a steaming cup of tea with both hands, she watched them arrive, some familiar, others new, each one crossing the threshold with the quiet hope of being heard. The center had many rooms, each designed with intention. One room held knitting tables, baskets overflowing with yarn, and worn chairs that invited not productivity but presence. Another had bookshelves filled with memoirs and journals, poetry, and stories written by women who had lived too long in silence. The back garden, small but full of color, had a wooden bench beneath an old magnolia tree. Rosa had requested that part herself. She believed in giving space to reflect before healing could begin. In the hallway near the front entrance hung a large photograph of Rosa, taken the day of her national interview. She was not smiling in the picture, but her eyes held a serenity that spoke louder than any grin. Below the image, in gold lettering, were words chosen by Margaret from one of Rosa's first speeches. "You never know who is watching, so treat everyone as if they are someone important, because they are." The wall beside it displayed framed photographs of other women who had come through the program. Some now teachers, others entrepreneurs, artists, mentors. Some had gone on to start programs of their own. Each picture had a small plaque with a name and a word they had chosen to describe themselves after recovery. Words like steady, alive, resilient, and enough. Margaret arrived just after 10 o'clock that morning. She was slower now, her steps more deliberate, but her eyes were as sharp and kind as ever. She found Rosa in the garden, sitting on the bench beneath the magnolia tree, her tea now half finished beside her. Margaret joined her, and they sat together without speaking for a while. "The name," Margaret finally said. "It suits this place." "I didn't ask for it," Rosa replied gently. "That's what makes it right," Margaret answered. They watched as a young woman arrived at the gate, holding a small child's hand. The girl looked no older than 5, her mother not much older than Rosa's granddaughter. The woman paused at the sign, read the words, and then walked in slowly, eyes scanning the space as if trying to believe it was real. "She reminds me of me," Rosa said softly. "She reminds all of us," Margaret said, "of who we were, of who we might have become if someone hadn't stopped to see us." As the day continued, the rooms filled with quiet activity. Stories were exchanged over tea. Scarves were made, not as products, but as prayers. Women read to one another, wrote letters to their past selves, and made plans for futures they had once stopped imagining. Rosa remained calm, steady, but she could feel something swelling in her chest, an emotion not born of sorrow or pride, but of completeness. The ache that had followed her like a shadow for years had lessened. She could feel it. It hadn't vanished. Some pain never does, but it had softened, as if saying, "You've carried me long enough. Let me rest now." Later that afternoon, Veronica arrived. Her presence was quieter than anyone expected. She wore no jewelry, no high heels, no tailored suit, just a soft sweater, plain trousers, and a small box wrapped in fabric. She approached Rosa with careful steps and offered a smile that no longer sought approval. Rosa stood, met her in the center of the garden, and they embraced gently. "I brought something," Veronica said, handing over the box. Rosa opened it to find a folded scarf, cream-colored, finely knitted, clearly made with care. But it wasn't perfect. The stitches wobbled in places. A small tag inside read simply, "Forgiven and forgiving." "I've been practicing," Veronica said with a small laugh. "It's harder than I thought." Rosa held the scarf in her hands. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she looked up. "This is the most beautiful thing you've ever given anyone," she said, and she meant it. As the sun dipped low over the city, the women of the center gathered in the garden. No one had planned it. They simply gravitated there, one by one, until the benches were filled and the rest sat on blankets or leaned against tree trunks. Someone played soft music from a speaker. Tea was passed around. Scarves were draped over shoulders, not for fashion, but for meaning. And then Rosa stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "We built this not for praise," she said, "but for peace, so that no woman, no matter her age, her history, or her wounds, would ever again wonder if she mattered." She paused, scanning the faces of women from every walk of life. "You are not broken. You are building. You are not invisible. You are in bloom." That night, Charleston was quieter than usual. But inside the Rosa Center for Women, there was light. Not just from the lamps, but from the stories, the memories, the futures being imagined. Rosa sat once more beneath the magnolia tree as evening deepened. Her granddaughter had fallen asleep inside, curled up with a scarf she had helped knit herself. Margaret had gone home to rest, and the rest of the women were beginning to leave one by one, hugging, laughing, promising to return. And Rosa stayed, because sometimes the ending of a story isn't a close, it's a quiet reminder of what matters. Dignity, compassion, and the unshakable truth that every woman, no matter how many years she's lived or how many times she's been overlooked, still has the power to change the world, one stitch at a time. As the final light flickered in the window and the stars emerged, Rosa whispered softly to herself, "I was forgotten once, but I never stopped being someone." And now, the world would never forget her again.